All right, this should start up in just a second. It does take like a few seconds of going live before I actually see anything. And let's see. All right. So let's see. At this point, you should actually see me. Hi, folks. Steven here. I am on the phone, I guess you could say, with Ann from Pikapi Podcast. And this is going to be our discussion of the music of Pokemon Stadium. Mm-hmm. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to talk a lot about the music of it, both like in terms of background detail and what we know about production and a bunch of other stuff. However, what we're going to be doing today is there's some new news or speculation / news or whatever around Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution, the CGI remake of the first Pokemon movie that came out in Japan earlier this year, and we might have gotten our first real clue as to what might be happening with it in the States. And by the way, do let us know. I think we calibrated in a test stream regarding like how much what the volume is for me and Anne, and we should be coming out about even here. So hopefully that all works out. So, but if we're way off for some reason, let us know and we'll try and get that one resolved. But so we got a very small modicum of information regarding Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. Let's see here. Let me make sure my preview stream is at auto. Let's see. That's probably okay. All right. Just checking. I keep a computer over on this side of the screen here so I can see what's going out to the live stream. But we're going to talk a little bit about that and give our thoughts on that. I've done a little background research. There's a little article on the Pokepress blog if you want to take a look there. But with that out of the way, I think we're just going to get started. Hopefully that gives us a little time for people who are here for the Steam discussion to get moving on here. But let me see here. Let me hit go ahead and start recording. And I'm going to record on my side there and there because we do want to kind of record this for posterity in case I decide to do something with just this first part. We are going to record the entire Stadium discussion as well, separately as audio. That'll hopefully sound a little bit nicer than what you've got on here. But just to let you know, the first thing we're going to do here is a little discussion about some news regarding Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. All right. So those of you who have been following my channel may remember that a couple weeks ago, I put out a video doing what information I could find on the Western release of Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. This is the CGI remake of Pokemon the first movie, just the main feature that came out in Japan back over the summer, back in July, and we've heard extremely little about it as far as here. As you may remember from that video, I did reach out to my press rep at the press agency that represents Pokemon, and all they could really tell me was stay tuned, which was kind of predictable. I kind of figured that would be the case. I thought we might get something in conjunction, say, with the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Nothing there. I did forget to mention that the Game Awards, I believe, are coming up. The Video Game Awards, and that would not be a bad place to announce something either if they're doing something for this movie. However, through a little work, someone on Twitter was doing some digging, and let me do a quick screen share on this. Let's see. And application window. So let's see. It's interesting. I thought Chrome tab, right? Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Here we are. All right. So what you should actually be seeing now is a website. I have no idea. It's a Netherlands website. And I don't know, it's a ratings website. What I mean by that, not reviews. It is a website that covers age-based content rating for, I guess, movies and also for video games because it references PEGI, P-E-G-I, which is the European equivalent to like the North American ESRB. Okay. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Anyway, so someone from the Netherlands was kind of digging through and found out, if I can get this to scroll. There we go. Yeah, so we got a classification for this. It is listed as animation. It's like I said, it's partially in, I guess, I forget if it's Dutch is the name of the thing there, or Danish or whatever. I forget how it all shakes out there, but you can see that it's rated 6+ or whatever you want to call it in their term there. They have categories for like 6, 9, 12, 16. Lists a little bit of violence and a little bit of fear, nothing terrible.
Those are some lovely little icons.
Yeah, it's a little different than like the MPAA or the ESRB does. But I really want to call your attention down here below where it says, let's see, director, year production, doesn't have an actual duration, but it does mention organization that submitted this apparently is Netflix, which is very interesting. So at some point, it looks like, at least in this territory, at least in the Netherlands, this will be coming to Netflix. Now, the reason this is kind of interesting, and I won't leave this up too much longer because there's not much else here to see, is that you may recall that this does not necessarily preclude the possibility of a theatrical release. Netflix has been doing some of those over the last year or so. Somewhat famously, last month, they had a movie come out called The Irishman, I think it was directed by Martin Scorsese. And let's see here. How do I undo the share here? 1 second. I can probably just close it. And yes, that does solve that. All right. So what happened there is that they had that come out last month, and they did get some theatrical stuff out there for it. And I suspect that given the current market of for 90s kids movies remakes and stuff like that, that Pokemon really was looking for something bigger than the limited digital events they've done in the past. Because to be quite honest, I think I'm not a movie business expert or anything, but I would expect that for a well done, say, release of this movie in theaters, Pokemon, the company's take should be at least in like the 8-figure range. So I am, I guess, fairly optimistic, a little bit cautiously, that this is going to still have some sort of theatrical run. Now, the thing is that Netflix has had a lot of trouble, at least especially in America and a few other countries, getting theaters to agree to sort of their terms of how long they want it to be exclusive in the theaters before it'll stream on Netflix. And that was a big problem with The Irishman, that did not see as many screens as Netflix would like, because they just couldn't hash out a deal with some of the major theater chains, particularly here in the U.S. And it'll be interesting to see what comes of this, and what this would explain, though, why Fathom Events doesn't have an event for this. I would have expected that if they were handling it, it would be one of the biggest things they've ever done there. And I was thinking maybe that either, like, of the more traditional movie studios, I would have thought that either Warner Brothers or Disney would have picked up this movie for distribution if that were the case, because Disney obviously has the in with the TV show in the U.S. being on one of their sub networks. And then Warner Brothers, of course, has a long history with the franchise, including earlier this year's Detective Pikachu movie. So they would both kind of have an in. And I was kind of looking at their schedules, but I guess that is a possibility. Netflix doesn't publish stuff quite as widely. And I've been talking for about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes there. You haven't had a chance to add too much in there. What are your kind of thoughts?
Well, for my part, I'm actually a little less optimistic about it getting a theatrical release. Like, you make extremely good points, and it would not be at all out of the realm of possibility for Netflix to have a product that also got a theatrical release. I'm sure this movie is not gunning for any Oscar, so they don't have to navigate any of those stipulations of how long it has to be in theaters, etc. But for my part, we've heard so little about this movie, like, just in general. And of all the movies that have come out lately, it was one that I was most curious about, but not necessarily looking forward to seeing, because I don't know that we necessarily needed a CGI remake. I can see a lot of executives being like, well, the small children who are a fan of this show don't know these characters. The adults will, like, unless that CGI is a lot better than the clips from the early trailers I've seen, it could be. Like, the adults may not be as into it because it's different than Detective Pikachu. I can see a lot of people being a little more willing to shy away from this one in particular, and let it go to Netflix and see how it does there first. And then if it gets a bigger push in marketing, so be it. So, like, I'm not sure what to expect. Like, the fact that I've not heard, as you say, anything from Fathom events, etc., like, makes me a little less optimistic than you are, but it would be nice to see it in theaters. I certainly hope it happens.
Yeah, I did some digging on this into, what happened. Netflix doesn't really have a long enough track record to really be able to, determinedly say this is, if they are doing a theatrical thing with this would be one of the first times they've done it with a more young focus. They've done more serious dramatic movies.
Yeah, the
Not
ones
that
they're trying to get the Oscar push for, that so they have to release it in a theater to get that.
Yeah, they have to do like 2 weeks in New York and LA for that to count. And then the different other like award stuff, like, People's Choice and other stuff like that have different different criteria for that. There's a lot of stuff in flux right now, and it'll be interesting to kind of see what happens. I do suspect that if there is a theatrical component to this, and like I said, I think that if they didn't, they would be leaving a lot of money on the table. I mean, you look at the say what you will quality-wise about Aladdin and the Lion King, and Pokemon the first movie doesn't have quite that reputation, but if it could pull in, worldwide a couple $100 million, which is not unreasonable given the correct distribution and whatnot. And we do know that, like, there's been some mutually related stuff that's happened recently, like the last month we had the tin that was tied into it. If you look in the fine print there, it does reference the movie in a few places. And then we got the Pokemon, what is it? Oh, the Pokemon Rumble Rush mobile game, I think, got some Mewtwo stuff. And so did Pokemon Masters. You got Giovanni and Mewtwo as a sync pair.
Yeah.
So that's some very interesting developments. And maybe that was just the stuff they couldn't move to the actual release date or something like that. Because, I mean, I want to see this movie in a theater because that's the kind of experience I want to have with it.
Yeah.
And I think, it's something, I mean, Netflix has purchased up a few theaters, like the Paris Theater in New York City. If I have to fly to New York, we'll see how that one works out. I might be willing to do that for this, but I'm hoping, I think they've had more luck with like movie theaters in Europe, which I think are a little more associated, those being individual smaller countries. They've had better luck in some countries than others. And
so we need to make a trip to Europe.
Well, I don't think it'll be that bad.
Okay.
Nothing against Europe. I am planning
it's a long way for us.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see, kind of what happens with all of this, and if we will maybe get some information soon. But this is not an uncommon way for things to get revealed, as people find like a film rating or something like that on one of these sites, or from the MPAA or something like that, to get that information, and it might explain some of the deals there. Like I said, they do seem to have some things they're doing for this. It'll be interesting to see if this does get a theatrical release, especially how far they go with the merchandising aspect. And, are they going to try and do like a fast food tie-in, which is common for children's movies?
Right, yeah.
And are they going to do, they've done a little bit of TCG stuff. Will there be more and things like that? So, and any other thoughts before we go into the Pokemon Stadium discussion?
Only that, like, I'm just so baffled by how much we don't know at this stage that I feel like we've known about other movies previously. Like, it just seems that all the information we're getting about this movie is rolling in very disparate avenues at odd times and few and far between. I certainly hope it all comes together and we have a great movie and like there's a good marketing push behind it. I just feel a little surprised like this movie is all like going to come, and if I blink I'll miss it almost.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. I've kind of heard the excuse that, oh, it did terribly in Japan, but as I pointed out in that video, it did about the same as, say, Everybody's Story, The Power of Us as We Know It. It's a little hard to tell because some of one of the units is in like yen and the other is in US dollars, which makes it pretty difficult. But
yeah, I haven't heard that it's done bad. I just haven't heard I haven't heard that it was this amazing sensation. I haven't it just seems to have just came.
it might also have, in Japan, it came just a few months after Detective Pikachu, so it might have been suffered a bit from proximity or something like that.
We may have just not heard squat about it because we were so focused on all the other news. Yeah.
And the other thing I kind of wanted to mention is that doing it through Netflix, as opposed to, assuming this isn't some sort of combo deal with one of the other studios, like a split thing or something like that, gives the Pokemon Company probably a little more freedom to handle things the way they want to and call some more of the shots than they might get with a more traditional studio. Because, like I said, given the current economics, it seems difficult to believe they wouldn't at least have gotten some sort of offer for a theatrical run from somebody.
That's an interesting thought. And like maybe if this works out well, like in the future, these types of deals will be better for the Pokemon Company in the long run and being able to control their properties a little more hands-on as they get distributed throughout the world. Like that could be a very interesting outcome.
Like I said, a lot we don't know. We may find out some stuff relatively soon, or like I said, if it's not the Game Awards, if they don't announce something in conjunction with that, we may not find anything out until next year. So no real way to tell with these types of things.
Yeah, we just want to see the movie. Come on, guys.
Yeah, I've definitely wondering what they're going to do with it musically. All right, So before we start our Pokemon Stadium discussion, let me just lay things out, how things are going to work if you haven't been to one of our discussions before. The way these usually work is, let's see, well, earlier this year we ran out of movies. It took us only about 3 years, so to get through all 20-something, and that includes stuff like Detective Pikachu and doing a number of special episodes on various things to get through the 20-some movies thus far. Once Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution does actually come out in English in some form, we will probably do an episode on that. If you want to know what we thought of the original movie, you're going to have to look outside the podcast feed, either on this channel or into my SoundCloud, to find out like episode 0, I guess you could call it. But the way these usually work is we're usually going to talk a little bit about the game itself in terms of like its release and stuff like that. We're going to talk about our initial experiences with it. And then we're going to go into a very much music-focused discussion. So the way that's going to work is that we have, we usually start by talking about any technical background as well as the people involved in the music of the game. And then we go into, after that, we sort of describe like the overall sound of the game. And then we go into individual tracks. Ann and I have each picked out 3 tracks we want to show. If you have other ones you want us to talk about, go ahead and type those in the chat or as a comment. If you type them in the chat, we'll try and get at least a few impressions on them for this time. If you type them as a comment, we will try and get to those in a future discussion. We do like to go back to those. I don't recall if anyone made too many comments about the music last weekend when I did my live stream of the game itself. If you could retype those, unfortunately, it's a little difficult for me to access those while we were doing the live stream right now. But that's sort of the gist of it. And then at the very end, after we do the next episode intro, then we usually record a bonus segment where we talk about the game itself and sort of our feelings about that mechanically and things like that. So I'm going to do an intro, leave a pause, do a little intro, and then let's just sort of go from there. Like I said, if you want to have any questions, we can try and answer those. Go ahead and type those in the chat. But otherwise, I'll leave a bit of a pause, and then we're going to go into our Pokemon Stadium music discussion. Hi, folks. Steven here. I'm on the phone with Anne from Pikapi Podcast, and we've come to our next discussion in our Pokemon side game music discussion series. This time, we're going to be talking about the music of Pokemon Stadium for the Nintendo 64. We're going to be talking about, first of all, some background information on the game, a few specific tracks, the overall style, and we'll also be doing at the very end sort of a bonus segment on the game itself and how do we think what its legacy is and stuff like that. But first of all, let me punch up some notes. Okay, as far as the game itself, it has kind of an interesting development history. Not unlike Pokemon Snap that we talked about last time on this series, it was one point was planned for the ill-fated Nintendo 64 disk drive add-on. Remember that was an add-on that attached to the bottom of the N64, only ever really came out in Japan, and even there was not much of a thing. Eventually, it was moved to a cartridge, but perhaps partially as a result, the Pokemon Stadium we know here in the States is really the second game in the series, because in Japan, there is a Pocket Monster Stadium game that came out back in, I guess, 1998, and it only had 42 playable Pokemon based on what was most popular in Japan tournaments at the time. And the rest they had models for, but not animations. I know that may sound a little familiar to some recent events, but I've sort of prided myself on not talking about that on this channel. But in any case, somewhere about a year later, or the following year in 1999 Japan, and then in the first/second quarter of 2000, we got what we know of as our Pokemon Stadium. It has all 151 Pokemon that were available up to that point. And according to some stuff I looked up, I couldn't get a consistent value for like sales figures, but it appears that this was one of the perhaps the biggest selling Pokemon side game up until some of the Mystery Dungeon games started coming out about 6 or 7 years later. Then we got to that point, and that was kind of broken. And what was kind of your original experience with this game when you played it back in the day?
Well, when I was about in junior high, my family finally bought our first home console, which was an N64, and this was one of the games we bought for it. And like I had loved Pokemon a lot, so obviously I was into it, and my siblings and all. It was something that we could play together, and also something that I could hog and play by myself. So it was a lot of fun. I just remember a lot of we got out of school early on Wednesdays at that time at like around noon. It was crazy. And I just remember a lot of Wednesday afternoons of me being home before all the other kids and being able to just binge play Pokemon, and the mini games especially I loved. I liked the tournaments too, but I was all over the mini games.
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about some of the music from the minigames later. I definitely picked this up sometime in the spring of 2000. I don't remember exactly when. I would have been in high school. And, it was actually a kind of an oversized box because it came with this thing called the transfer pack that you would attach to the N64 controller in there. But as far as the game itself, I kind of progressed through it, and not sure I have amazing memories. There was definitely some parts I liked more than others, but it was a nice addition, and I kind of do lament the fact, and we'll talk about this some in our bonus segment, that after the fourth generation, the Diamond and Pearl generation, and in fact just that part of the generation, we haven't gotten games like this. And now with stuff on the Switch, maybe it seems kind of redundant, but I think they could have gone on a bit longer. But yeah, I'm not sure I have really a ton of memories of playing this back in the day that are really specific and stuff like that, but I definitely got a lot of use out of it and got decently far. We'll be talking about the structure of the game a little bit as time goes on. But you remember with Pokemon Snap, we talked about how there was really just more or less one person who was in charge of all the musical stuff in there. And actually, it was kind of the last game she ever did. This time we have more or less the opposite scenario. There's about 6 or 7 or 8, depending on how you decide to count, people who worked on music for this game. Some of it is definitely inherited from the partial version that only came out in Japan back in '98. There's definitely some music carried over there. Let me explain why the credits for this are fairly long.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of them, and many of them I could find very recent credits for and are probably still working at Nintendo today. This was very much composed by folks who are from the Nintendo side, even though this game was developed by HAL Laboratories, as most of the N64 side games were in some way developed by HAL. But let's see, who do I got here? I made a whole list of who these folks are. Let's see, there's Toru Minagishi, who also has credits for Splatoon and Mario Maker 2 that came out earlier this year.
Legend of Zelda.
Yeah, there's a lot of Zelda tie-ins here, as well as a bunch of other Nintendo franchises. Kenta Nagata worked on 1080 snowboarding for the N64, which was obviously a snowboarding game. I have the soundtrack for that. And then Mario Kart 64, which I'm sure most of the folks here are familiar with, at least some version. And apparently he's also credited in the deluxe Switch version of Mario Kart 8. Masafumi Kawamura, who is also credited on Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Mitsuhiro Hikino, who is credited on the Pikmin franchise. Let's see. Hidaki Shimizu, I hope I'm getting these right. He's one of the two people who I think are credited more with the sound technical side.
Yeah, I was going to say I've found in my research, usually Masafumi Kawamura and Hideaki Shimizu were usually credited as sound programmers, but like there's a really thin line in some of these records as to which were they composers or were they just the programmers? I don't know.
Yeah, Hideaki is interesting. One of the other credits I found is that for the Animal Crossing games, at least like probably the one on the GameCube, he is credited with creating the NES emulator there, which I believe is actually the one that would be used later on the Wii Virtual Console. And I think to some degree, even on like the Wii U Virtual Console, some of the code was used there. So kind of a pretty important person in a certain way, not necessarily to the music per se, but to sort of the some stuff you may be very familiar with if you've been in the Nintendo ecosystem for a while. All right, so let's see. I've got a few other names. One of them we'll be saving later, but one I wanted to mention was Questar Welsh, who apparently like handled some of the English side recording duties for things like the announcer voice and a few other things there. He's apparently from something called reel-to-reel recording, but one of them is REEL, one of them is REAL. I was actually able to dig up, I think, an old website that belonged to him that had an email address that I tried contacting via. I didn't return sender, but would be interesting to learn more. As far as like other, he appears to have done a fair number of things for 4Kids. He's credited on music to Duel by the Yu-Gi-Oh! Album and Pokemon Christmas Bash. That's kind of what I was able to dig up there. Did you have any other thoughts there?
I've found some interesting trivia on some of these guys. For Kenta Nakata, I dug in a little bit. Like I found, as you said, he's kind of a staple of Nintendo. It looks like he's composed a lot of music for Mario. Sorry. He married his coworker Shinobu Tanaka, who has composed a lot of music for Mario, and I wrote that down just because I thought it was super cute. Toru Minagishi is kind of interesting because it seems he's largely self-taught in music, and he eventually did, get to study a little bit and take some classes and piano lessons eventually, but starting up, like he basically had a career before he started getting any special musical education, and just was so interested in music he taught himself, and apparently was inspired by Modest Mugorsky. Like he did a project where he did a bunch of musical movements set to paintings by this artist named Victor Hartman, and the idea of matching the music to these still visuals kind of gave me Nageshi the idea that like video game music, which he also loved, could be a profession for him. So he kind of followed that path and self-taught his way to the top, it seems, which I think is really kind of cool and inspiring.
Yeah, definitely some interesting things. I mean, having played a lot of the games here, like Hajime Wakai appears to be credited as, I guess, the backup composer for Star Fox 64 under Koji Kondo. Also credited on Pikmin and up through like Breath of the Wild for Zelda stuff. So, like I said, a lot of these folks seem to still have careers. Nintendo has a kind of a reputation for keeping folks around a long time. And things like that. Security. So yeah, they've not having to go third party or anything like that. They've had sort of that luxury there, but large cast characters, and some of that may well have to do with the fact that this game was iterated over several times, effectively speaking. May explain why there's such a pretty decent number of folks pretty decent number of folks who are credited with it. Before we get into individual songs, let's talk about some of the sort of the general music characteristics here. Now, as we mentioned in our Snap episode, the N64 does not really have any sort of dedicated sound hardware. Yes, there is a feed that goes into like the multi-tap or the multi-out on the back of the console. Let's see here. 1 second here. I got to close a... but there's and stuff like that. But in terms of like, there's no dedicated like sound chip like you would have on, even the Super Nintendo or the PlayStation or the Saturn. Most of the work has to be done by the main CPU itself for any type of sound that comes in there. That being said, most games are sample based in terms of that, and they have some standard sound engines. As far as the sort of instrumentation, I kind of have some interesting thoughts there, but it definitely seems to be using a very much a sporting event type of sound. There's and this is not meant to be a slight against this, but there's definitely a very much a marching band quality to some of this, although there is some strings, some guitar, and some pipe organ, which is also kind of a sporting events related instrument that you'll hear, particularly I would say at baseball and sometimes sometimes basketball and hockey. Sorry about that. And did you kind of get that feeling as well as far as the instrumentation goes?
Well, I was actually a little surprised when you said kind of a sporty quality until you brought up marching band, and this score loves its horn section so much. So yeah, now that you bring it up, I can see like a high school marching band playing some of these songs. And that kind of fits in with the idea of like the league tournaments and Pokemon Stadium and the way I've always kind of pictured Pokemon as a sport. But yeah, like it's an interesting soundtrack. It's especially listening to it on better headphones than you might, just hearing it come out of your N64 back in the day. I think I got an appreciation for everything that's going on in this soundtrack. I don't think it always came through when I was young. I definitely didn't appreciate it.
Yeah, and like I said, not to insult, marching band, because, carrying an instrument and playing it while moving in step and stuff like that is hard. I'm not going to deny that at all. They weren't trying to sound like a concert band or a concert orchestra as much as they were going for sort of a live in-person performance like you would get at like a high school or college sporting event, a stadium, like a football game, or maybe some other stuff.
Yeah, it's capturing that different energy than you would get in a very nice concert hall with that type of a band. You get a very different feel than what it seems that they're going for, which has just that energy of like, we are all outside and in this event and everything's loud and our spirits are high. Gambare. Like, yeah.
And we'll sort of discuss about how successful we think that is. I think there's parts where it does better than others. But I think the other thing we should mention is that there are some original tracks, a few of which we'll be talking about in this discussion. But a lot of the music from the game is very clearly derived from the red, blue, yellow, green, I guess, if you were in Japan, series of games that had been out to that point. And, that is actually a bit limiting. The original games, if memory serves me, there are only 4 battle themes in the entire game. There's one for wild Pokemon, one for trainers Pokemon battles, and then then another one for gym leaders / the Elite Four. And then there's one for the final battle with the your rival champion. And if I remember correctly, that's it. There is not a separate theme for like battling Team Rocket Grunts. There's not a separate theme for battling legendaries. Your rival doesn't normally have their own battle theme that you get in there. So they had to kind of improvise a bit with some of the tracks here, rather than there are a number that seem to be fairly straight, higher fidelity versions going from the Game Boy to the Nintendo 64 of game songs, but they definitely had, in some cases, very limited stuff to work with. Anne, did you notice any of that yourself?
When I was playing the game, no, but when I was stopping to pick out tracks for this, I did notice there's not all the tracks that I expected would be different, such as battling your rival or the Team Rocket Grunt. And some of those iconic tracks and moments that you would have in a Pokemon game that often just seem to be the same music as other places, etc., or didn't seem to be there at all. I did notice that. But yeah, while I was playing the game, I didn't notice it at all.
Yeah, I think to get like a 4th battle theme, they had to reuse the Team Rocket hideout theme or something like that. It was either that or the cave theme or something. It was one of those 2 tracks or something like that they had to repurpose to get some extra battle music in there, which was a bit of an interesting choice. Before we go into tracks, I do want to mention one more thing, and that's that this is one of the very few side games that has a commercially released soundtrack. There is a dual soundtrack that was released in Germany through what is basically the German equivalent of Nintendo Power Magazine, and may have been given some other ways. That is a combined soundtrack of Pokemon Snap and Pokemon Stadium. And I think we talked about that a little bit during our Snap discussion, and there are also some remixes on that album. And it's got kind of a reversible cover, which is kind of neat and all that stuff. But if you do want to pick up a physical copy of the soundtrack, that is a definite option there. Okay, so if you followed our other discussions, you know what we do is that Anne and I will each pick out a couple songs. And we've done that here. We've each picked out 3. But the first song that I picked out is from the way the game is structured. There's a few kind of main modes. There's a mode where you go through all the gym leaders and the Elite Four and the champion. And then there's a set of different rule sets you can use to go through a series of 8 different trainers and sort of work your way through that. And that's divided, like I said, into 4 different things. And sort of the smallest one is called the Petite Cup. I think it's called the Little Cup in some of the later games that have a similar mode. But basically, this is for very low-level, unevolved Pokemon. And the way these 8 round things are structured is that usually the first 3 rounds have one song, the 4th through the 6th one have another song, the semifinals has a song, and then the finals has the 4th song from that level of competition. And so one of the ones I picked out is the Petite Cup, which has, like I said, the unevolved Pokemon. And this is rounds 1 to 3. So this is the kind of the first one you hear. And there were a couple of things I kind of wanted to call out about this particular song is that, first of all, it has a very up-tempo beat. It sort of sounds, going back to the whole marching band concept, it's sort of a fight song or has a marked quality to it. And did you kind of concur on that or have some other thoughts?
Yeah, like just so much brass, so much brass. It's so fun.
Yeah, it definitely a lot of brass and percussion.
Mhm.
Bless my mother. I did kind of voice this soundtrack on her while we were driving to my cousin's place for Thanksgiving a week or two ago. And she said she kind of preferred if there was less percussion and stuff like that. But no, it definitely goes for that. And then structurally, it has a lot of little bits and pieces to it. It has a very fast
Mhm.
intro, and then like there's a brief slow passage where at least where some of the percussion fades away. Maybe that just makes it feel slower, and then it sort of speeds back up again. And like I said, I don't know if it really actually changed the tempo or if the beat just changes enough to make it sound like it's getting slower.
Mhm.
Um, and then sort of the other thing I want to mention with it is that if you listen to this one, there's a very clever use about. It's hard to say exactly where because these are video game tracks, so they loop indefinitely. But there's a part where it uses the Pokemon Center recovery chime as sort of
Mhm.
a I don't know if stinger is the right word, probably not, but you kind of get what I'm going for there. Did you kind of notice that, Anne?
Yeah, like, I loved all the little places where the xylophone came in, and it it seemed to be playing a lot of other motifs that, like, seemed very familiar to me, but I couldn't place them. But yeah, when the xylophone came in, like, at the end of a phrase with, like, just dun dun da 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 da, and, like, went on its way. It was just so cute. Like, you're right, it's really clever. There were a lot of, ways that themes and chord progressions and the like were mixed together in this track and used in unexpected ways so that it sounded very much like there's no doubt this is a Pokemon track, not like a Mario track. Like I think I even heard like an opening of World of Pokemon at one point.
Yeah, that's one of the great kind of things about this. And I think that's about all I had to say about that particular one. Do you have any other thoughts, Anne?
Um, no, I didn't notice a whole ton of difference between like the Pika Cup 1 through 3. It seemed to rely more on its drum kit later on, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, well, I guess that's about all I have to say about the that particular track. And let's go to one you picked next. And let's go to one you picked next. It's the Pika Cup semifinal music. So this would play in the
Mhm,
seventh of the eight ones that you go from there. If
mhm.
I remember correctly, this is derived from the Gym Leader slash Elite Four theme from the main games. Is that about right?
Um, in my head, it sounded a lot more like just the regular battle music, but yeah, definitely the more important battles, like that dun dun dun, and it's sort of but like, Petite Cup, it's kind of remixed in a way that's just a little bit different. It has a slightly different rhythm, and this one, like, it's so dramatic. There's timpani everywhere, and it kind of alternates between a couple loudish moments, but then the low horns. Ah, like, there's such an interesting feel about this music that sounds so very familiar to us that I really love.
Yeah, regardless of which sort of competition thread you go through, you'll notice that the as you move from battles 1 to 3 to 4 to 6 to the semifinal to the final, that the music does get more tense and more dramatic and stuff like that, regardless of which one you're in. And for this particular one, it's got kind of the way the low horns are used, especially, I think. This one is one of the ones that definitely seems to have a lot of Star Fox 64 influence, at least to me. And I suspect may have been arranged by Hajime Wakai.
Mhm.
No idea for sure on that one. Arrangement credits for video game music are often quite difficult, especially when there's this many people involved. It can be very difficult to sort of figure out who is in charge of what. I mean, obviously, all the game music, since this is Gen 1, was done originally by Junichi Masuda, but like I said, different people working on here. And it just kind of reminds me of the reason I brought up the low horns is that that's very common in a lot of the particularly later in the game in places like Area 6, or maybe to a lesser extent in the Star Wolf theme from Star Fox 64. I think that sort of motif there is very similar, and I got a very similar vibe that, if I didn't know this was based on a Pokemon song, that I might think, was this a lost track from Star Fox or something like that? But I don't know how much experience you have with the Star Fox 64, Anne. That might have been a little before you got your system.
My friend had Star Fox, and we played that a lot. But I probably still don't have as much like affinity for it as you do. But that's not a terrible guess, because you're right. Like this, like you can tell they're part of the same game, but they're also very, very different. Like the Petite Cup, as you say, is a bit more of a marching bandy, sporty quality to it. This one, like you almost wonder, like you could play a Dungeons and Dragons themed game to this music during parts of it. Like again, it just kind of has this dramatic feel. So yeah, it's interesting what all these different composers working together on the project could bring to it, because they do sound slightly different. Like maybe one of them could be in a different game, whereas Petite Cup definitely couldn't.
Yeah. So, like I said, the Pika Cup, a little bit further up and more, I don't know, adult is probably not the right word, but more grown up overall. But like I said, each one does follow that little trend line within it. So I think one thing you mentioned earlier is that there are a number of mini games here. I believe there are actually 9. There's a few more in Pokemon Stadium 2, which is the gold silver one. And we each picked one from each, and we each picked one mini game theme to sort of go with. I picked Sushi Go Round. This is the Lickitung game where you're trying to eat sushi that has the highest value on there, and your goal is to eat as much in the time allotted. The music for this, as you might kind of guess, is, I don't know how truly traditional it is, but has a very Japanese feel to it, and the actual melody to it is it's actually very percussion driven, and things like that. And I actually think that if you just listen to the track, it's not maybe that interesting. But once you have there's a lot of sound effects, not just from the Lickitung, but it seems like there's like a some sort of like Japanese announcer, and there's like Anne, can you fill us in on any of this?
Okay. So the game, you're basically at a kaiten sushi, which is a sushi restaurant where the sushi comes out on a conveyor belt in plates. And if you're eating at that restaurant, you just take a plate off the conveyor belt. And when you're done with your meal, you pay for all the plates you took. And some plates are more expensive than others. I loved the kaiten sushi a lot. But during the game, as the conveyor belt is going around the Lickitung are eating, there is this guy who sounds very much like a sushi chef. Like he starts the game like "Irashai," and but he is calling out the different types of expensive sushi that are coming up. Like when a shrimp sushi comes up, he'll call out ebicha, and for the uni, which I forget what that is. I think it's the fish eggs. He'll call out the unicha or the ogaricha or whatever. So if you spoke Japanese when you played this game, that may have been slightly helpful to you. If you spoke English when you played this game, it is extremely less helpful. It's just background noise.
To be honest, now that you've explained that to me, I think I can kind of understand that a little bit more. And then, let's see. Well, yeah, that makes a little more sense to me now. I can definitely remember those phrases there. And I think even like the countdown going into it is a little bit of a percussive beat to it. So it is very thematic there, quite obviously, although obviously that was kind of lost on a lot of us who don't speak Japanese. I don't think I went to any place like that when I went to Japan a couple years ago. So I can't really say.
It's a lot of fun and not as expensive if you go to just a regular, run of the mill place. Like it's a pretty inexpensive night out for a lot of good sushi.
Yeah, not sure how much else I have to say about it, but that was some great things to learn there. And you've picked out another one of the mini game themes. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I picked Magikarp Splash, not because I loved the music so much as Magikarp is my spirit animal, um, but this is a song where, well, in the game, you just basically try to flop your Magikarp up and hit the little ticker and try to flop up more times than the other guys. But for such a short game and honestly not that fun, like it's a very fast paced and driven piece of music. Like the first like 2 beats are very like just kind of intro chords and blasts of music like da da and then suddenly it's like and there's a lot going on in that piece. Like it sounds like the xylophone, and while it's probably all synth, like in my head I always have this picture of this mad xylophonist just running up and down his little board there. But it's a very short piece of music, just like 500 notes in it.
Yeah. The mini game, only lasts about 30 seconds or so, give or take. I forget I was looking up the world record is like 36 or so dings or whatever you want to call it there. And I kind of compare the way it sounds a little bit to Flight of the Bumblebee. It has kind of that quality, not as melodically memorable as Flight of the Bumblebee, which I think is one of the best examples of that rapidly changing beat and stuff, or pitch and stuff like that, which is, I'm sure, very difficult to play manually.
Well, yeah,
but
Flight of the Bumblebee, like if we're using that as our example, like originally it was played on the violin, which is an instrument that like it's a small flick of the wrist, but like trying to play that same piece of music on say a tuba or something that is much more difficult and time consuming to change notes is quite a task. So I imagine something like this, like if it was played on an actual instrument, was very difficult. If it was a synthesizer, like maybe not so much. Computers can help you do a lot of things, but
yeah, and indeed there, and we'll talk more about the mini games probably in our bonus segment. But the music for the mini games, I think my mom did have a comment about that. She had a very much like a circus or carnival type of sound to it, more so than the main game, which is more of like I said, maybe a collegiate marching band type, sporting event type thing there.
that kind of fits. I hadn't thought of it described as a carnival, but that really works for the contrast between the mini games and like the main we're fighting with our Pokemon game.
Yeah, definitely a bit of a dichotomy there between the modes of the game, which is always kind of interesting to observe. I suppose at some time in the future we can compare the Magikarp's Splash song to Magikarp Jump. The mobile game has very different music than this little mini game does. So that's something we can maybe cover sometime in the future.
Happily.
All right, well, we got a couple more specific songs to look at. You mentioned the Hall of Fame track when you were sending a list to me, and now the Hall of Fame is it's used in a couple places in the game, but you're specifically referring to the Hall of Fame where like all the models go after you beat a mode with that Pokemon. Is that right? And that one's a little slower, right?
Yeah, that is what what I think I'm talking about. Like I know I heard that motif in a couple other places in the game. But when I played it, when I remember playing it for this podcast and when I watched when I clicked on videos and looked up tracks later, yeah, it was the Hall of Fame where you get to scroll through and see your Pokemon. And yeah, it's such a grand and majestic track. Like another one where they just loved their horn section, but you get like just a swell of sound, and bits of it definitely sound inspired by the type of music that would be with the Champion and the Indigo Plateau, and like similar chord progressions, I guess. Like I very much got that feel, if it's not the exact melodies. And there's also like this high synth trilling, which is really well, kind of grating at some places. Like some points, it's really a high synth, and sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not. But and then with the really low notes underneath it, there's something about it that really strikes me. I like it. There's very classical composition about this piece. A lot of different instruments doing a lot of different things in a way that works together. That reminds me of my time. I didn't do marching band, I did concert band, but where every instrument has their own thing going on and they're all so widespread and disparate, but then they come together for the movements, and it's and makes the greater whole. And I really enjoyed that type of composition for this type of game. It feels like you want maybe more of a pop track for a video game, but I really like that classic style, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this track up because actually the bass Hall of Fame track is actually featured quite prominently in the recently released Sword and Shield games. It's I think used on the title screen as well as in like the final champion battle and stuff. And this version that we have here is a little more slow. It's also a little, I would say, a little more formal and regal, maybe, than some of the other versions. Certainly, than the version that plays when you finish a mode out and you see all the Pokemon you used on your team, and especially, obviously limited by the Game Boy hardware. The version that's used in the main game, which is sort of that very short loop with the little rising and falling that goes in the background of that one. And this gives it somewhat of a different quality, which I'll definitely admit there. And I do kind of agree that not all the samples worked out maybe as well as they could have, or I would have liked on this. And we'll probably be talking about more of that a little bit later. Do you have any other things to say about the Hall of Fame theme?
I think I've said it all.
All right. Well, I did want to mention that. Sorry. All right. Well, I picked out kind of two tracks for my last choice here, but they are closely related. So the way this game is structured is that there are two rounds. You finish everything in the first round, and then you get to do basically the same stuff, but everything is more difficult. The Pokemon are stronger. The AI is a little bit tougher. Not sure if it's as tough as the reputation for like the Pokemon Stadium, Pocket Monsters Stadium that came out in Japan originally. That was Japan exclusive, but basically you go through everything twice, and the second time, of course, it's harder. That kind of structure. We mentioned it a little bit with Snap because just like Snap, and I guess another N64 game I like to mention, Diddy Kong Racing, there are two credits themes actually in this game, and unlike Snap, where one is stylistically very different, in Snap, there's one that when you just complete the main game and get that Mew picture, and then there's another one when you complete like all 63 or so, not 64, 63 photographable Pokemon in there. In this particular case, there is, you go through it once, you get one credit theme, then you get another one. Stylistically, they are very similar. They have sort of a jazz style feel to them. But what I find interesting is that you beat the first round and you get this song that sounds, fairly complete and like you've accomplished something and stuff like that. I was never good enough to do this, but if you complete the second round, get all the stuff done in there, you get, I think, basically the same credit sequence, but with a different song that has more of a less complete feel to it. And I feel that's kind of intentional, but I also kind of feel like these two should be switched. And that big info dump I just gave, does that, what do you think of that?
I like the idea of the two being switched, especially like I would agree with you. The round 2 one, like I don't know if incomplete is the right word, but yeah, there's something about it that we're like when you think of switching them around, I'm like, oh yeah, that's better. But yeah, like there's a lot going on in these tracks, especially in round 1. Like it takes a lot of changes, and like honestly, when the track opens, like I thought it was kind of odd. Like it was just a weird track, and then it changes to that beat, and then it gets odd again, and the little trilling notes, and somehow turns into this adult contemporary easy listening thing. There's a very familiar tune in there that I can't quite pick out what it's from. Maybe you can. But so it feels like the a lot of the other tracks that are using motifs from Red and Blue. But yeah, R2 is kind of like all those things except like concentrated into a syrup. And even more of that adult contemporary. Like I wrote in my notes that if this were a cartoon concert, Kamanashi Kazuya would sing a solo to this. No one gets that joke. That's okay. But it's very strange. I like it, but I don't understand it.
Yeah, I suppose that's one way of putting it. But like I said, I think maybe, because if you've completed round 2, you've basically seen everything this game has to offer.
Mhm.
And, kind of as a result, this theme says, well, maybe you should keep going and keep doing more, which is kind of an odd statement because you think that they'd be doing the that one first, and then the chief says, oh, but wait, there's a harder mode for you to try. But I guess they really want people to keep going at it or something like that.
I mean, it does have a lot of play value for the mini games, I guess, and for the ability to battle with your friends once you're done the main plot. But yeah, it's just an interesting track. It would be interesting to know what was kind of going through their minds when they worked on this track specifically, like what they were trying to evoke out of the audience. But yeah, when you bring up switching it, I do think that might work a bit better. But
yeah, kind of hard to say with all of that, but I just kind of felt it worked out that way. Well, that kind of does it for the list of tracks we were planning on talking about. There's still more to discuss in this one, though. If you in the chat or anything have any tracks you want us to talk about, go ahead and give us a comment. Or if you're watching this on replay, give us a comment on the video, and we'll try and work those into a future discussion. However, there are a few more sound-based aspects we definitely wanted to talk about here.
Mhm.
So first off, there are Pokemon voices in this game. Now, as far as actual voice acting, those are mostly in the mini games. And if you have a Pikachu that you brought in from Yellow version, you'll hear Pikachu's actual voice in there.
Mhm.
Kind of a bit of an odd divide there. By contrast, most of the actual Pokemon in the battling aspect, they sort of emulate their chiptune cries from the main series games, but sort of filtered through a bit of some sort of processing or something like that gives them a more definitely a less 8-bit type of feel to them. They sound, honestly, I don't think they use the exact same processor or anything, but when Pokemon X and Y came out, they use those more advanced synthesized ways of handling stuff. And any thoughts on kind of either approach that we see around here?
Well, you have a lot more knowledge of the technical aspect. Like for me, the sound of the Pokemon cries in this game seemed to be like higher def versions of the bit noises from Red and Blue. Like I could actually understand the different Pokemon, which sometimes on the Game Boy, especially those early games, like they all just sound like chiptune tribbles. Whereas this, it's like, oh yeah, that does sound like a bird. So like I can see as the technology progressed up through like X and Y and the like, um them being able to change how they record the sounds and use the sounds in the context of the game. Again, you have more technical knowledge on that than I do. Um so I was actually a bit kind of impressed that, oh, this sounds so much better than I remember my Game Boy sounding. But again, it filtered through the N64. I don't think I appreciated it as a kid, definitely.
Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying there. That yeah, it definitely does sound. They sound related, but they're definitely different sounding, and that's probably just because they didn't want to try and if you're wondering how they made those sounds in like the Game Boy versions, I have an interview with a guy who did a great little video. Guy's name is Retro Game Mechanics Explained, or Dots Are Cool. Did a great video explaining how the Game Boy side of things were done, and they sort of adapted that, I suppose, here. But it does sound a little more rich and full, and some of them actually sound quite good, and it gives you a better idea of what they might have been going for there. With what I like to call those voices in the old school games. I like to call those the modem screeches. But yeah, so that's about what I have to say there. So there's another part of this we should definitely talk about, and that is the fact that optionally you can turn it off. There is an announcer in this game, which is actually, honestly pretty impressive. We had talked about Star Fox 64 earlier in this discussion, and that had a lot of voice in it. But they were able to cram a ton of it into this game, thanks to the fine folks at the, I believe now defunct, maybe someone owns the name, but I don't think the software house is around anymore, Factor 5, which developed that really good speech compression, which I believe they also used in some of their Star Wars games that they did on the N64, like Rogue Squadron or Battle for Naboo. I think they also made heavy use of that, as does the sequel to this, Pokemon Stadium 2 for Gold and Silver. So it was kind of it's kind of an interesting situation because, the N64, they have those cartridges and, they don't have a ton of space on them. So this compression format made it so they could fit a lot more on there. But sort of the sort of paradox is the cartridges have the fast load time. So you could do sort of that real-time commentary in some ways a lot more easily than you could on a disc-based game where you'd have to load everything into RAM off the disc, which could take a long time and hard to cram things. As far as who does the announcer in the English version, that person is Ted Lewis, which I thought was actually like a catch-all that they use sometimes. But it turns out he seems to be a specific person who worked with 4Kids for quite a while. As far as the Pokemon franchise, I believe he does do the battle announcer voice in certain episodes of the TV show, along with a zillion other characters. Yeah, he's probably best Tracy Sketchit. He does that voice, and when the announcer's voice goes up a little bit, you can say, "Yeah, that definitely sounds a little bit like Tracy, doesn't it?" What do you think of the announcer overall, Anne?
I like him. His performance at the time was a bit disdained by critics. Like, there was all these jokes about, like, I'm so glad I can toggle this guy off. But I'm finding that nowadays, like, a lot of people on forums are praising him for just being very animated in his performance and making it sound like he's invested in your exciting battle. Which, as you mentioned, like, for this type of video game voiceover and the type of game it is and cartridges and the technology of the time, like, was a little bit hard to do and a bit of a rarer thing. But he was just very excited and into it and sounded like the Pokemon League announcer. And I remember I always loved throwing out my Magikarp and what's the point of splashing? And yeah, like, he just, and like Jinx, like, what a lovely kiss. Like, he just was really into it. And I think he made the game better.
Yeah, I mean, he has like a phrase for like every Pokemon in terms of like he has their name in there, and like every attack in there, and a whole bunch of different scenarios. There's probably stuff I've never heard, just because they were able to, with the compression that Factor 5 was able to give to HAL, they were able to squeeze so much in there. Which, like I said, it's a kind of a weird dynamic. You have less space to work with, but it's faster to access, so they can do that kind of real-time commentary based on what happens in some ways more easily than a disc-based system would do. I think Stadium 2 also has the announcer. We'll talk about that probably sometime next year. And then they didn't do an announcer, I don't think, for the third generation Battle Revolution or Gale of Darkness games. And then they brought it back. They have a different person. They have I forget his real name, Roger Parsons, the announcer for most of the history of the anime, including now, is the voice of the stadium announcer in the Gen 4 games. Now, speaking of people who've been announcers, and I think you found the person who had did this in there. And in the Japanese version of this game, there's also an announcer. I think you tracked down some information on that guy, Anne. Can you give us some information?
Yeah, a bit. His name is Koichi Hasabe. He's a voice actor with Arts Vision, and seemed to get his background in theater acting. And I discovered that he belonged at the time, like possibly even helped found a theater company called Sugoroku, um, which seems to do a lot of children's theater and like family shows and ghost stories. And I read somewhere that like every autumn they do a big show for elementary students. I'm working from like translating from Japanese here, so it's hard to really say. But like I found a lot more about this company than about Mr. Hasabe. But apparently it produced a lot of voice actors who went on into animes that were really popular that we would recognize today. And was also started by voice actors, which I think is an interesting dichotomy, like both that he came from a theater background and then a bunch of voice actors went and did theater. It just seems like two worlds that don't often mix, like two avenues of acting that don't often come together, because you wouldn't necessarily audition for a voiceover role with a theater resume and vice versa. So that was really interesting to me, and apparently it has some prestige. But much like Ted Lewis, like Hasabe has been an announcer and a voice, not just in the stadium game, but also at various times in the anime. So he's done a lot of one-off roles, and again, a couple announcers, and the league voices, and he seems to do a lot more older gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we ever get to see the announcer. Maybe we do at some point in the TV show or something. I guess we must at some point or something like that. We usually just hear him
occasionally at one league at least, but there's a lot of leagues.
But yeah, I guess the other thing we should probably talk about is there's a lot of sound effects in this game, obviously, for all the various moves and all sorts of other stuff there. Some of the attacks sound really cool. Some of the beam-based attacks have some nice sound effects. I always remember with the announcer voice, a psychic blast and stuff like that, because obviously that's a very commonly used move in this game. And things like that. But overall, what do you think of like the music overall in terms of like how would you rate it or something like that? Like how does it stand in the pantheon of Pokemon games? And do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I'm of two minds, because on the one hand, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It gets you excited, and then it kind of like just backs off. You like, when I was playing, wasn't really paying attention to the music. It was exciting, and like it built up my energy, and it was pretty, and like the Hall of Fame was majestic, and the mini games were like fun, but they basically just kind of set the mood for the game I was about to play, and then I didn't notice them anymore, which isn't that a rule of composition? Like the best compositions are the ones you don't notice. They just do their job and you don't have to think about them. But at the same time, like I remember some other Pokemon games where they use sound in really cool ways, like say Roxy's gym in
Black and White
Black and
too.
White? Yeah, where it's like if you defeat all her band members, like each instrument falls out of the background music one at a time as you beat them until you finally face her and like there's nobody else playing. Or like in Sinnoh, where there's all this great music, but then you walk into that church and it's just silence. So like I feel like this game didn't have as many opportunities to do things like that, so I shouldn't criticize it for not um being able to play with music in creative and different ways. But like when I think of like the pantheon of great Pokemon scores, like it is always those ones that did some very unique and creative things with music specifically that you had to notice. So, like I said, I'm up two minds. On the one hand, it did the job of a video game score or of an anything score. And on the other hand, it's like the ways they used the score could have been more creative, but given the constraints of this game, like it's basically just a stadium battle game. I don't know what else they could have done with it. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you mentioned that some of the dynamic stuff. I mean, we mentioned that in each 8 match series, the music would get more serious as you would move through there. But there's nothing like in some of the games, some of the main series games, where when your opponent is down to their last Pokemon or your Pokemon is at low health or something, they will actually change the music.
Right.
There's nothing quite like that here. As far as the overall quality, once I kind of got a hold of in my mind that they were going for that sort of live sporting venue music, rather than maybe necessarily the highest possible fidelity they could achieve with the instruments they had available. Things started to sort of gel for me, although I think there are a couple like instrument samples that don't sound the greatest. There's some guitar work that doesn't sound the greatest. There's one of the versions of the I think it's in the kids club or something like that, the minigame section, that has a variant of the bicycle theme is not all that great to listen to. As far as I'm concerned, there's like 1 or 2 instruments that don't sound real great there. But overall, I really do enjoy the music from this game. It's different than what we get with sort of like some of the modern games on several levels. And it does seem like they had more or less a consistent vision for a lot of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next discussion, we do these pretty much in order of the U.S. release date. And based on that, our next one is going to be Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy / Game Boy Color. So this is basically a digitized version of the card game that has cards from the first couple sets of the trading card game. You may know that a long time ago, I did pretty much a full Let's Play of this game on my channel back when I was still actively doing those, where I would actually scan in the real card and show that over the picture to give you a little comparison, because they do some neat little like sprite art things with the card art. Unlike, say, Stadium, which you would have had to have an original cartridge because that hasn't been re-released on Virtual Console. If you want to pick up a copy of trading card game for Game Boy, you can either find an original cartridge or it is easily available on the 3DS Virtual Console. That one doesn't have as much music to work with as Stadium does. Stadium is actually music-wise a pretty big game, but I think we're still going to have a pretty good discussion there. Until then, Anne, thank you very much for helping out here.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Stephen Reich. All right, folks, thanks. And then what we're going to do next is we are going to do our little bonus discussion where we talk about the game itself and some of the aspects there. I appreciate everyone who's been around here. We've been going for over an hour and 15 minutes so far.
Yeah, we know you all have lives, so thank you.
Yeah, with that bonus segment we did at the beginning, that was this has gotten to be a little bit longer than usual, but I think we've had maintained a pretty good pace. If you do have any tracks you want to call out here, you can go ahead and type those in the chat. It looks like we got a good reaction to doing the trading card game for Game Boy. Very different from everything else, and that one has kind of the reverse scenario. There's a Japan-only sequel that we never got here in the States for whatever reason. I don't even think that's on like the 3DS Virtual Console in Japan or anything, which is kind of too bad because I have a Japanese 3DS I could use. But we're going to talk about sort of the game and its mechanics and sort of going back to the Gen 1 fighting mechanics that this did. All right, well, let's talk about Pokemon Stadium, the game itself. So, I mean, one of the criticisms leveled at this game, I guess we should get out of the way right away, is that in order to get the full use out of it, you really do need to have one of the red, blue, yellow, and I guess in Japan, green games to go with it. because otherwise you're stuck using rental Pokemon that are generally not as powerful. It is possible, people have done it to beat the game 100% pretty much without having to bring in their own Pokemon, but it's considerably easier if you can train your own Pokemon and get your own moves there.
Mhm.
So that is one kind of limitation, and it has that kind of weird transfer pack, and you can even like unlock. There's a Game Boy playing mode that you can have in there, and you can actually use that to run the games, and you can unlock like double and triple speed, which is kind of interesting there. But it's curious. And what did you have to work with when you did a replay of this recently? Did you have like you were stuck with the rental Pokemon,
I was
or?
stuck with the rental Pokemon for the replay. I seem to remember as a child that we were able to import some like from our Game Boy, but like I don't remember much about that. I don't remember that we did it often. Again, I was much more into the mini games. But yeah, like on the replay it was definitely all rental Pokemon, and it is difficult. It is difficult. But but yeah, again, it can be done. Like you just have to think and plan your journey a little better, I think.
Yeah, and it's, let's see. So yeah, there is a bit of limited value if you don't have those, and I do when I go to events and stuff like that where they have Stadium out there. A lot of folks will just go ahead and play the mini games, because those take less time.
Mm.
A lot of them are really, like Magikarp Splash is a good example, have, to be honest, very little depth to them and are maybe not the most interesting. I think some of the more interesting ones are the ones like the Sushi Go Round and the Ekans Diglett minigame. The ones that aren't just button mashers, I think I find the most fun with. So that's kind of, if you don't have that, you can always do those types of things. But even I when I played this, I had most of my Pokemon were registered. I have my childhood copy of this game, and it has teams registered for a lot of the modes there.
Cool.
From folks in my game. But even then, when you get to round 2, that can be really difficult. Like, I guess I should mention right about now the battle mechanics in Gen 1, sort of move over to that area, very different from what we see today. Now, obviously, there's like 3 types that don't exist, and you can almost say that there's a 4th because there are no offensive dragon type attacks except for Dragon Rage, which does fixed damage. But in addition to all that, the battle mechanics for this game, there's a whole interesting story behind there, because actually they did not supply HAL with a direct like flowchart or anything like that. Basically, Satoru Iwata, because he worked back at HAL at the time, was stuck spending like a week reverse engineering the Game Boy assembly code or whatever it is to try and figure out how everything, and he got things pretty close to right. There's a few little inaccuracies, like if something is has 0 effect to the type advantage. So like if you try to use a fighting type attack against a ghost or something like that, instead of saying it doesn't affect, it says like it missed, which is a little confusing sometimes. But he did a pretty darn good job there. But there's all sorts of weird stuff in Gen 1 mechanically, like you get more critical hits if you're faster. So for example, in like round 2 of one of the competitions, I had this Ninetales I could just not beat. Because although it was using Fire Blast against my Blastoise, that is, obviously going to resist that, it was still doing like over half damage because it would get a critical hit practically every time because it was so much faster, or exactly how, I forget exactly how it works, but it works very differently than what we have now. And, some of the attacks have different properties and stuff like that. Toxic is obviously very different. Trying to think what are some of the other major changes beyond the lack of a couple different types. Obviously, this is way before Gen 4, so we don't have these. The special physical split is all by type, not by move. So that kind of limits the viability of certain Pokemon. If they don't have a good physical attack stat, even if one of their types is like rock or ground or something like that. there's not a lot you can do with them, which has kind of its own issues. So there can be kind of a narrow range of possibilities there sometimes. What about you, Anna? Did you have any Gen 1? Oh, yeah, that's how that worked moments playing through this game?
A few. It was mostly due to like type advantage, which is the same problem I have whenever I go back and play like Pokemon Yellow of just like, oh yeah, that's a thing. like fire, like the Pokemon that gained the steel type that did not have it in Gen 1, not being weak against fire is always my downfall. But
yeah, Magnemite and Magneton will trip you up a little bit if you're not used to the fact that, oh yeah, they don't have steel yet, so their only weakness is ground. Similarly, like the bite attack is normal here.
Right.
I think there's a couple other.
Yeah, anytime
there's
I'm
a couple
facing
other
a psychic or a ghost, and I was like, "Where's my dark type?" There is no dark type move. Calm down.
Yeah, there aren't even very good. I mean, the only practical ghost moves, there's Lick, which does virtually no damage. It's a very weak attack. It has a chance to paralyze, which is nice. And then there's also
Nightshade.
there's Nightshade,
right?
Which is just seismic toss basically, because it does damage based on your level. So the type advantage wouldn't even matter there. A lot of things they kind of had to fix for Gen 2 to slowly improve the rebalance the mechanics. Yeah. So, and then there's only one special stat. So all those little Gen 1 quirks are all present pretty much in this game that we've since been, ironed out and stuff like that. So things like that. I had mentioned earlier in this discussion that the last time they made a game like this was back in the 4th generation. For the Wii, they made Pokemon Battle Revolution for the Diamond and Pearl. And sort of the catch there is that they didn't bother, because you didn't have kind of like, you didn't have ways to really update things. It kind of, once like Heart Gold and Soul Silver came out, you couldn't use it. Even Platinum wasn't really designed for it because you didn't have the alternate Giratina stuff in there either. And since then, I guess they decided, like, after starting with like Gen 6 or whatever, once they started doing the 3D, I guess they kind of decided, well, we don't really need those anymore. But to be honest, even though the frame rate in this game is not super great, there's a fair bit of slowdown and sometimes very low frame rates. I have to say that if you've watched sort of the 3DS games, even if they're playing on like a new Nintendo 3DS or whatever, the frame rate in those double battles that they do there is not very good. And I really would have liked to kind of had a game like this on, say, like an updated version for the original Wii or a version for the Wii U. And, now maybe it really is with, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee and Sword and Shield on the Switch. Maybe everything's conversion. We really don't need a game like this anymore. But any thoughts on any of that, Anne? Sorry to kind of talk at you like that, but
yeah, no, I was thinking, like, I've been watching, I don't have a Switch yet, but I've been watching my friends go through Sword and Shield. And just the capabilities of that game, and the way it almost is modeled off of more of a tournament, I think, when you get to the end, it seems. And even in Sun and Moon with the Battle Royale, and I guess ever since really they got the Wi-Fi internet global connections to really be a viable thing, I feel like I don't know about frame rates, like that is definitely more your territory, but as far as the experience of playing that type of game either by yourself or with friends, and kind of having that Pokemon Stadium type battle, and the way the graphics have changed where, it's not like just two-dimensional sprites, like you can have 3D and there's cameras going around and cuts of you and the other trainer and the Pokemon. I can see how maybe a lot of people are like, you know what? If we remade Pokemon Stadium, we're basically just remaking one small aspect of games that we already have. But at the same time, like, I do think if they were creative about it, there is a market for it. Again, with the technology that we have today and the way things have progressed.
I don't know. I think maybe part of me just really wants a Pokemon game with an announcer. Like, no disrespect to the people who do the streaming, and do the voiceovers there, but part of me kind of likes that, as cheesy as you might think it is, and that's something we've definitely been missing from the more recent games, along with a not real great frame rate when you have 4 Pokemon in play with highly complex models and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess there really is at this point not so much a need for a game like this to really exist, which is in a way kind of sad.
I feel like with a little creativity, they could find a way to rework the Pokemon Stadium, what is it, conceit, the premise and the idea, and find a way to have it alongside some things that you just can't get from the main series games, which was what was so magical about Pokemon Stadium when it came out, was like you got the big grandiose sense that you couldn't really get from your little handheld game, and you got to have that experience with friends in a way that you couldn't have in just your regular link cable Pokemon battles. So I think I don't think we need a Pokemon Stadium as it existed in the past anymore, because I think that basically just exists in our main series game now. But I do think there is a way to take that concept of what Pokemon Stadium gave you that wasn't in the main series game and make that like to find those things that are relevant to us now and make that a side game. But that is a tall order to ask of the game department, I guess, but I think it's possible.
Were there any other aspects of the game that you kind of wanted to call out there? I kind of wanted to mention that, we sort of alluded to it a little bit, maybe, that after you beat all the modes in a given round, the last thing you get to do is that you get to do this is something you can only really do in Gen 1 because of the way things are, I guess, not balanced, is that you get to do a 6-on-1 battle against Mewtwo, who appears above the stadium, and then you get to sort of fight that. You build a team, including potentially your own Mewtwo in there, and you get to try to take it down like that. The first one is not easy. The second one also has amnesia and I think recover, which makes it a lot more difficult. But you still have like 6 Pokemon to do it with. That's something they like to stick in, is Mewtwo as a final boss, even in some of the more recent-ish games. I'm trying to think what the most recent game where they might have done that is, but nothing's coming to mind because it's actually been a little while. But there's a bunch of little other games where Mewtwo is sort of the penultimate boss. Like one of the Ranger games is like that, and things like that. And of course, we mentioned in a little pre-thing we did here that around the time we recorded this, they added Mewtwo stuff to Rumble Rush on mobile and also Pokemon Masters on mobile. And I wouldn't be surprised. We know that Mewtwo is somewhere in the game data for Sword and Shield. I guess you can maybe transfer it over somehow, but I don't know if they're going to do an event or something like that. But having this release relatively close to Pokemon the first movie, regardless of which territory you're in, certainly provides a little bit of context there, I suppose.
Yeah, Mewtwo is just cool. Like, it shows up and like it just screams like boss or penultimate boss. Yeah, I think that would be something that that they can always do, is like you beat everything and then suddenly some legendary Pokemon or some big thing, like there's always something bigger in the Pokemon world. Rayquaza Arceus could come down and you make your own team to battle them. There's a lot of options and things, and as cheesy as they were, the mini games were my favorite part of that game. Like, there is always going to be a place to stick little fun things like that in the Pokemon world, whether it's in the main series game or a side game. And again, just finding those things that are cool and unique and like things you can only do with Pokemon, or things that have a fun challenge to them. I think there's always room for it. You just got to find it. Because I could play Lickitung eating sushi all day long.
Yeah, the mini games are a nice touch. I mean, that was one of the complaints about Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, is that the game corner doesn't have. You can see what some of the things are on there, but you can't do anything with any of them, which is really a shame. That considering it's based on Yellow, they didn't bring back the surfing mini game or stuff like that, which is really kind of too bad. And in Sword and Shield, they have cooking and the camping. So always, don't discount having something that's not just straight up battling and progression in that form to break things up. That is a kind of a nice thing. All right, I think we can stop the recording here. Thank you very much to everyone who showed up. I'm going to stop the broadcast momentarily, but thank you to everyone who showed up. We got a great crowd for this one. If you do have, I have one more comment. Oh, I got a couple comments coming in.
Maybe I'm doing the chat wrong. I don't see any comments except
I see from Trainer Lucarion has a couple comments about the mini games in there. Yeah, people have a lot of great memories, even though, like I said, I think some of them are very button mashy, and a few of them I really like. The ones that have at least a little bit of timing based or interaction stuff. Like I said, where you have to do at least a little bit of thinking, but don't even then just discount them as something that you can use to break up the gameplay. I don't know if some of those I would call Mario Party quality, although some people have some things to say about Mario Party quality. But
no, I'm with you, Trainer Lucarion. Like just a Pokemon mini games collection of games. I'd play that.
Yeah, we might at some point talk about the Pokemon Mini. Although things like that we'll probably talk about when we get to Pokemon Channel, because there is a virtual Pokemon Mini in that one. And that's probably where we'll end up talking about that. That's a Gen 3 side game, although the Mini itself, I believe, is a Gen 2 product. And we'll probably talk some about that. But yep, so next time around, not sure exactly when it's going to be, sometime at least in January, maybe February. We'll see how Anne's schedule works out. We'll be talking about Pokemon Trading Card Game for Game Boy, which has some neat stuff in there. Lots of little things that are kind of funny in it as well, and things like that. We'll also probably draw some comparisons there to the modern trading card game online and how that's going on. And I love that. I really do like the music in the trading card game for Game Boy, since I have a lot of experience with it, I suppose, is part of the reason. But yeah, until then, I think I'm going to close out the stream. But thank you very much for everyone who came in here, and see you around sometime soon. I think next weekend I may be doing a Pokemon Go Community Day report on Sunday, because they're supposed to be doing that. Assuming it's not as cold as it's supposed to be on like Tuesday or Wednesday here in Wisconsin. We're supposed to be in like the single digits. But aside from all that, thank you everyone for coming.
Have a good night, guys.